home economics is basically what it is, really getting down and dirty with your food supply, learning to store foods, what foods you need to buy, what foods you shouldn't buy, and then mixing those ingredients with long-term foods to make, a culinary arsenal, I call it. So, one thing that people won't find in the course, there's about, 15, 20 videos on freeze-dried foods, but those are the things we want to they last 25 years. You talk about some of that kind of stuff. We want to leave that stuff in our pantry, but we want to be using things that are easy to get: oats, wheat, corn, rice, canned foods, and mixing those with garden fresh ingredients.
Inflation in the U.S. will climb between 6 and 9% by year's end, said Steve Hanke, who served on Ronald Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors. Said the rapid growth in money supply, work fueling asset prices. But the negative side to this, the rise in inflation in 2021 has been caused 100% by growth of the money supply. When inflation spikes, commodities like gold, silver, lumber, real estate have historically surged. Learn how simple it is to add physical gold and silver to your portfolio ahead of the rise in inflation and predicted price rises. Patriot Gold Group has the no fee for life IRA, where your IRA or 401k can be in physical gold and silver, and you may be eligible for the no fee for life IRA. Call 1-800-356-4470 and get a free investor guide today. And the knowledge that Patriot Gold Group is Consumer Affairs' top-rated gold IRA dealer 5 years in a row from 2016 until present. Click the link in the description box below for more information. And now on with the video. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Special guest, Kevin Snow, Chef Kevin Snow, as a matter of fact. A lot of the things I talk about, crop losses here, economic reductions over there, but today it's going to be more about what we can do about it. So we're going to talk about harvest eating, and Chef Keith Snow has the Harvest Eating YouTube channel. Also, if you go back and look at some of the prior videos there, had a television series of harvest eating, and then also right over on harvesteating.com, talking about regenerative agriculture, growing your own local food, consuming your own local food from your gardens, from community gardens, those around you, so that distance to the plate from where it's produced is minimized. Today's talk is going to be all about how to store foods for a longer amount of time, because right now things are bountiful in the harvest. If you go to farmers co-ops, you're going to find every bin's full. Bulk buying, I buy from the Amish sweet corn. They had 15 pounds of green beans for $15, but that's in a bulk. So wherever you go right now is the best time to buy foods. And then think about the seasonality of the foods. It's going to switch over to fruits later on, from the present fruits that we have with apricots and different types of summer berries, which we need to store those up. But then we're going to switch over to the apples, the pumpkins, and you can get that full year round. So probably, I'm going to say 6 months of the year, you don't have access to, very fresh foods. So you're going to have to store that. And I am trying to learn the best I can here. I'm happy Keith is joining me because I am here to learn. And I'm really hoping that today's talk is going to give you some very solid information that you can share with your friends, your families, help you save money, help you have a healthier, diet moving through. I know canned foods have a lot of sodium, and I store food as well, but I like to mix fresh in when I have a chance. And this is what it's all about today. Storing the foods, being able to take what you have in different ways, fashions, and forms, and keep it up. Most people would say freeze it. Well, how big is your freezer really? Unless you're buying a new chest freezer or something, and that'll get full pretty quick as well. Refrigerator only has so many cubic feet in it, so where do you go from there? Glass jars, vacuum sealed, I don't know. These are some of the easy ones that I can ping on, dehydrating, but there's a plethora of others which Keith is going to share with us today. So Keith, Chef Keith Snow, I do appreciate you joining me today, and thanks so much for spending your time. We had a really good conversation yesterday about what we see moving into the future, food pricing, and we can get into some of that with supermarkets stockpiling for shortages. Writing's on the wall. And from a personal viewpoint, if you haven't seen something's changed by now, I don't think you ever are going to. Or those who haven't seen the change yet are not going to until they're standing in a food line somewhere. But that's where we don't want to be. We want to be able to store our own, grow our own, trade our own with others. So Keith, welcome. Floor is yours.
Well, David, thanks a lot for having me. I appreciate it. And just want to say hey to all your listeners and followers out there. And thank you for the work you do. Certainly, it's been eye-opening for me. And I've been in this food space for a long, long time. I started when I was 14 years old in kitchens and stayed in the food business for 30 plus years. I've got French culinary training, and I've served in some really big chef positions through the years. And then I found myself living on a farm in North Carolina. And one of the questions that always sort of nagged at me was, if you're a chef or a sculptor or an artist, everybody wants to know what your specialty is. And I cook all types of food, but I never really had something that I would call a specialty. I mean, a lot of chefs will say, oh, it's French food, it's Asian fusion. I mean, it could be any number of things. But when I landed on that farm in North Carolina and started gardening and growing food and making connections with farmers, because I grew up in a farm family, a dairy family in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, I quickly learned that seasonal cooking, farm to table stuff was what I was most passionate about. And when I started making TV shows, it was with PBS, and we did some pilots for the Food Network, but never succeeded in getting any of those on the air. So I turned to the internet and YouTube, and I was one of the first 100 partners on YouTube. So we made a lot of video content. Eventually, we put up harvesteating.com and started working with CSAs and local farmers to promote their stuff. And I was one of the founding members of Slow Food in Greenville, South Carolina, which is an organization that connects people to the source of their food. During that time, I was working with Whole Foods, and we were filming segments in their store. And eventually, the Harvest Eating TV show appeared on a pretty obscure network. It's actually in your home state there in Tennessee. It's called RFD TV. They're based out of Nashville. So we had a 2-year run on that network where we produced 20 full episodes, and we traveled all around the country. And the purpose was to show people doing great things in the food space, everything from crab farmers in the Gulf Coast of Florida to asparagus growers in North Carolina, dairy people, everything in between. So each show would have a location segment, and then we'd meet the farmers, and then eventually wind up in the studio kitchen where I would show people how to cook with the foods. So the point you just made earlier about seasonal food and sourcing food, that's been something that I've been focused on since 2005. And during that time, the big sort of diet in the industry was the Atkins diet. So a lot of people were doing low carb, and farm to table really wasn't a big thing. Most recently, I just served as a food and beverage director for a major ski resort in Sundance, called Sundance in northern Utah. Robert Redford used to own that property. And we had several restaurants where we sourced a lot of local foods. We grew some foods in the garden. But my work as a chef has taken me, to North Carolina and Colorado, also at ski resorts. So the training is varied, but the thing that I really like to focus on is the seasonal cooking. And in the last few years, since the 2008 real estate and banking collapse, I have focused quite a bit on making my family a little more food secure. So we started food, and on our farm, we produced as much as we could. And we were also really big at visiting farm markers and markets and CSAs and any place that we could get food, picking food. We would go every year during specific harvests like strawberries and peaches and blueberries, whatever we could, apples, and we would find ways to store those ingredients. So I've been doing a lot of that since 2008. Of course, recently you start to see what's going on with some of the weather patterns and some of the crops that are not doing so well. And so I've amped up a lot of that storage. Now, part of my work in the media is to serve on a show called the Survival Podcast, which is a really big show, gets over, I think, 200,000 downloads a day. And I'm their panel chef. So I've been fielding questions from that audience since 2011. And I guess it was about 2015, 16, a lot of the call-in questions that I would field were about how do I cook with stored foods? Because people were, I think they bought a lot of stored foods. They were on the internet, they got a little panicked about the financial system, so they bought a lot of foods. And then after a few years, they were wanting to know what to cook with them. And it was getting to the point where I was tired of answering those questions because they just kept coming. So eventually I thought, hey, wait a minute, the light bulb went off in my head. If people are this concerned about cooking, with cans of beans and rice and wheat and oats and corn, whatever they were storing, freeze-dried foods, dehydrated foods, maybe there'd be some value in me diving into it. And I'm used to cooking with fresh foods and sort of exotic ingredients. And we had probably spent over $2,000 a month with my family on food. That was our food budget. My kids have grown up very fortunate with the foods they've been able to eat. So I thought I needed to go into the pantry and stop going to the store and see, how this actually would work for us. So I believe it was 2016 April. I didn't go to the store. I just used what we had around in the garden, farm markets, our canned foods. And I started cooking recipes for the family to see how they would respond. And everybody really enjoyed the foods. So after that 30-day period, I set off on a pretty long amount of time producing videos and writing this course. I've got a writing partner up in Montana. He's a much better writer than I am. So most of the written material that go on the Food Storage Feast course, he did. And then all the recipe development and video work using my skills in the past with TV production, I did, but there was a change. Most of my TV work was on camera and, a 2-camera shoot and just more complicated. And what I didn't want was, the chef's personality to get in the way or the locations. I just wanted the food to be the star. So on the Food Storage Feast videos, it's usually from the elbows down with close-ups of the food, showing people exactly how to use these ingredients. So that took a long time to build. We launched that, I think it was January of 2018, and we've had really good success with it. And a lot of people have become students of the course. And what's neat for me is I can look inside. It's hosted on an online learning platform. So I can see who's online at any one time, what videos they watch, what recipes they download. So people come back over and over again to use the recipes and the resources that are in the course. So what I'm interested now is really kind of sounding the alarm for people, because they don't realize how bad some of the harvests are around the globe. They are starting to see that inflation is getting there and the cost of foods are really going up. And this may not be a problem for wealthy people. They might not even notice it. But if you've got a family and kids, you're going to notice your grocery bill really skyrocketing. So the things that you're talking about, finding local sources, home economics is basically what it is, really getting down and dirty with your food supply, learning to store foods, what foods you need to buy, what foods you shouldn't buy, and then mixing those ingredients with long-term foods to make, a culinary arsenal, I call it. So, one thing that people won't find in the course, there's about, 15, 20 videos on freeze-dried foods, but those are the things we want to they last 25 years. You talk about some of that kind of stuff. We want to leave that stuff in our pantry, but we want to be using things that are easy to get: oats, wheat, corn, rice, canned foods, and mixing those with garden fresh ingredients, things that we can source locally. When we chatted the other day, I mentioned where I am in southern Utah, we've got abundant apricot orchards. So I took my family out there, and there wasn't a soul out there, and we were picking, we probably picked 100 pounds of apricots in 30 minutes. So we took those home, and we dried a good portion of those in our Excalibur food dehydrator. And then we made some jam with the rest of those. So that food's we enjoyed certainly plenty of it fresh, but it's been put up and we can use it down the road.
Keith, can I stop for a second? Because you mentioned back in when you were talking about where you could find the CSA, for those who don't know, could you explain what that is? Because then you're on the self-picking, farms that are real popular right now. The most famous would be, fruits, mainly blueberries and different kind of tree-based fruits. But CSA, can you explain that for others who are going to go right into this self-picking, self-crop type of farming?
Yeah, sure. So CSA stands for Community Sustainable Agriculture, and there's several formats of CSAs, but it's usually when you're partnering with the grower or farmer. Sometimes it's at the beginning of the season where they'll ask you to make regular monthly payments to them, and then each week you'll go to either the farm to pick it up or a delivery area. Some of them are more complicated than others, and then you'll get a share of the harvest throughout the growing season. And you can find a lot of CSAs by visiting a website. It's called localharvest.org. And there are farms and markets listed. There's tens of thousands of them listed around the country. And it's a good point that you mentioned. That's one of the reasons I started Harvest Eating, was when people were visiting and joining these CSAs, they're getting baskets of food and they're panicking. So they would go on the internet, what the heck is kohlrabi, or how do I cook with a turnip, or, wild greens and all that. So that's when they started to really find the Harvest Eating content. This is 2005, 6, 7, 8. So I started to tailor a lot of my content around teaching people to use those foods. But there is a lot of food out there if you just look for it.
Yeah, now let me throw a point in there for you, because you mentioned the deep leafy greens. Now, from my own personal research, going back through these last 6 grand solar minimums back to, I'd say, solidly 2,400 years ago, 400 BC, they call it the Homeric minimum. What you find in these grand solar minimums, or you always get the economic destruction or reset, and the government's changed structure, and that's fine. But the population migration was kind of a dual fold purpose that people left. They couldn't find living or work, and it became so difficult to grow food that they had lack of foods. They moved to other areas. But one thing that kept recurring again and again and again in stories through the last 2,000 years, micronutrients, vitamins, and minerals were lacking, and that's the reason that people started to get malnourished, sick, cognitively impaired, physically impaired, the amount of work that they could do. So a lot of people are in the same, they're trying to equate today's workload with when you're going to be eating half the amount of calories or getting half the vitamins or nutrients. Your workload's not going to be able to sustain for a full 8-hour workday on the farm if you're only eating, or I should say in the city, if you're on rations. You're not going to be able to work the way you did. And these are the routine things that kept coming up again and again. And what it boiled down to, no pun intended, was lack of micronutrients and minerals in the body. Now, when you talked about the leafy greens, that's what got me onto it, because even during the wintertime, here in Tennessee, those mustard greens will still grow. I know they're a little bitter. There's a million ways to cook mustard greens. It's part of the Southern traditions down here. But that's where you're going to get an enormous amount of vitamins. The darker the green on the leaf, the more nutrients, micronutrients in there, especially the vitamins. And that was the number one thing that kept recurring. So if you wanted to talk to that, about the vitamin mineral content of the food that you're going to need to take into consideration as well, and some things that you could grow through the winter that'll still provide you with some of these vitamins.
Those are some of the most nutrient dense crops out there, some of these leafy greens. And growing up a Yankee from New Jersey, I don't think I saw kale until I was 21 years old. So it wasn't really a popular thing for me, but knowing the food culture in the South, having spent 10, 15 years in the Carolinas, that is a really important crop. And some of those cold hardy things can really do well. I mean, they can grow right through frost. And we've had cabbages, greens, all types of things like that go through some serious hard frost, even a light freeze, and we still got harvest from them. So those are foods that people, maybe they're not used to eating them, but they really should investigate these things, because they do have a lot of nutrition packed in them. They can be easier to grow. Also, some of the high quality dairy ingredients, when you talk about vitamins, fat soluble vitamins, good raw dairy, yogurt, these are things that have a lot of nutrition in them. And, touching on the regenerative agriculture side of things, if you're buying foods just from the supermarket, a little factoid is California supplies like 80%, 75, 80% of the fruit and nuts in this country. And I have European in-laws, and they've got very good fruit in Europe, and I've traveled extensively in Europe and France, filming TV shows and all that, and the fruit and the quality of the fruit there, it's so much better than the stuff you find in the supermarket, because most of these crops that are mass grown in the central valleys of California and places like that, they're not really grown for the nutritional content. They're grown for their ability to store and ship. And most of the fruits are picked completely not ripe. And yeah, eventually they'll change color, but when you pick something off the vine, it loses its connection. It's kind of like a baby and the umbilical cord. I mean, that's where the food is coming from, the vine, the nutrition from the ground. And when you cut that off, yeah, it's going to eventually ripen. And a lot of times they'll put them in a special room, and they use modified atmospheric pressure, like they pump different gases in there to make the food ripen. But the taste is just not there, nor is the vitamin and mineral content. And the fields at these major grow regions, they are not using regenerative agriculture. They're growing monocrops, they're spraying them a lot, and they're just not, the nutritional value is maybe 45% of what it used to be a few decades ago. So if you're eating just from the store, you're going to be missing a lot of nutrients. But when you start to find farmers markets and CSAs and grow things in your own yard, you're typically dealing with smaller people that care a lot more about the soil. And basically the soil, it's not just dirt, it's serious, there's serious things happening below the surface of the ground that most people just don't comprehend. And trust me, I've worked my way up as a gardener, thinking that you just plant into the red clay in North Carolina, and yeah, something comes up, but and over in Tennessee, this red clay is, it's atrocious stuff to grow in, and that it takes years using regenerative methods and mixing in animals on the pasture, on the property, to build diversity under the soil. Because if you don't have rain infiltration, if you don't have soil microbes, if you don't have all these fungus networks that grow, and if you're tilling the soil like these Central Valley farmers do, once you till the soil, you destroy those networks. So the plants will not grow unless you're using chemical applications. And these places where they get the NPK, a lot of it, there's only a few states. Tennessee has a few, there's quite a bit in Florida. And, to use the word raping the earth, I mean, that's just, it's amazing how they harvest these petrochemicals to make fertilizer, and then the farmer just sprays it on the crop year after year. It is bad for the environment in every way you look at it. So you really need to be sourcing better food. And your point, you go buy some greens in the store compared to what you could get at a farmer's market, and you take that to a lab and you test the nutrition, you'll be very surprised how different it really is.
Yeah, and I'll go on with that too, because, my pear, plum, and plum cot trees got ripped to shreds by Japanese beetles this year. But I use soap and water, and I'll go out there every 2 or 3 days, because I don't want to spray my trees, because that's going into the soil and I'm going to be eating that eventually. Same with the apple trees. They got some cedar rust. So what did I do? I went and bought some copper. I wanted to treat things as naturally as I could. Sure, I could get all types of fungicides and get up in the trees and whatnot, but that's not what I want in my ecosystem. And, speaking of the soil, we do have the red clay out here. And just today, before we got on our call here, we're down at the hardware store getting something called Soil Builder. It's like mulch that has broken down for another 8-9 months, where it's really just almost, I wouldn't say silk thread, but getting close between that really old mulch that's broken down into almost a powder, barely a step above that. Then we mix that in the garden bed, but we also use mycorrhiza with kelp, because you can buy a 50 or 100 pound bag of organic kelp. If you're looking at Allergies, and this is what we did when we planted our trees too, in the holes, we put, it was an oyster shell, we put in mycorrhiza, a little bit of peat moss, all those same things, the kelp and everything, to try to supercharge those roots and get that whole fungal network down. And at the same time, I'm working with a couple guys who are combining biochar and beam together to make a single product that, again, you dissolve in water and then spray over, and it helps that microbial network develop even further. Fully natural. I'm trying to go as far away from pesticides as I can. A couple reasons. The first one is obviously your health. And, you know, if you're going to be spraying that around, I raise bees. I don't want my bees killed off by any types of pesticides. Bees are expensive. They're difficult to keep anyway. And if I have a couple good hives, and I definitely do not want to interfere with those. Bees travel a long way. So if you're spraying in the front yard and you go back, you know, a couple thousand feet back on the other edge of the property back there, I mean, those bees are traveling up to the pond in front here. Secondly, what about the supply chains? The supply chains are not really, they're having a lot of difficulty. So if you're planning your entire edible, scheduling around being able to use petrochemicals to fend off pests, to give yourself that, you know, boost. If you go 100%, I have some 45% phosphorus, and that's great because you could use it for a few things. But if you're going to be doing that all the time, every time, counting on that for your food production, what happens if the supply chain goes down? Like, we burn our own wood out here and we save all the charcoal. And then what I do is I put it in a big 55-gallon drum or some other, we were using a 32-gallon trash can, put the charcoal in there, fill it with water, and then add the mycorrhiza and then add the kelp in there and let it sit for like 2 weeks until that charcoal absorbs, and then just throw that in the field or in the beds with it. So I'm trying to get all these different types of ways to stay away from chemicals and go 100% natural, but get that microbial base in the soil as churning as it can naturally. And we had an old chicken coop out here, ended up scraping that out and just liberally throwing it around in different places. Even it's been broken down for a couple of years. It's a super old chicken coop out there. I'm the same way, trying to keep it as healthy ecosystem as possible without disturbing the very fiber of life that gives you your life in terms of vegetables and produce.
As you were talking, it reminded me when I was first starting to garden on our farm in North Carolina. I, of course, wanted to go the natural route, and I had, you know, it was basically monocrop, like a bunch of tomatoes or single species plants, and they would get destroyed by the bugs. And then I'd watch my neighbor, and she had a tremendous harvest. She was a much older woman, but she would douse her plants with 7 dust. And this
I know that one.
It's been around forever. She would put it in an old a tube sock, you know, a big long tube sock, and then she'd just go in there banging it all around. There'd be white powder everywhere, and she would get a lot of harvest. But you know, you're thinking to yourself, well, you know, is that stuff safe? Well, you can't harvest it within 7 days, so I'm like, well, it's got to be in the soil. The soil is uptaking into the plant, and vice versa. You know, whatever's on the plant winds up in the soil. It can't be good. And that really started me on a path to look at other ways. And then I would see farmers at some of these big orchards, and they would drag these things that look like a giant missile down each, you know, row of the orchard, and they'd be in white suits covered with, you know, their face was covered, goggles, they'd have big respirators on, spraying these chemicals all over these trees. And, you know, you just think to yourself, you know, this can't be good. It can't be good. And then when you find other people that are doing it differently, for instance, out in, I'm in Colorado as I record this interview, out in by Grand Junction, there's a place called Palisades, and they don't have much bug pressure at all. A combination of it's not very moist, a little bit of altitude. So a lot of the crops there are not sprayed, and you can taste the difference in the fruit. So this goes back to what you were saying about building the soil. We have to get away from monocrops in this country and in our gardens. There's a lot of information out there that it's permaculture based, companion planting. So, you know, for instance, if you have tomatoes, you're going to get a lot of pests that want to eat the tomatoes. You know darn well there in Tennessee, if you plant squash, it's going to look wonderful until the squash show up, and then you're going to get squash bugs and stink bugs, and they are horrible. So in order to combat that, you have to use, you know, different plants. So around tomatoes, you can plant carrots, you can plant garlic bulbs. So you just have to have a lot of diversity in the garden. And sometimes there's pests, whether they be flying pests or ground-based things like squirrels or rabbits. You have to just know that they're part of the ecosystem and plan on putting things in the ground that they can eat. And a lot of times, just by doing the right companion planting. And, you know, if you've got rabbits that eat stuff or deer, you can plant crops that they like. And yeah, they'll eat some of that, but in the end, you'll wind up with a harvest without, you know, dousing it with dangerous chemicals. Because the chemical system, you're going to see, and I know you're seeing it, I don't think the public is aware yet, but this monocrop thing that we've been doing for decades, it's ending badly. It's terrible for the crops. It doesn't infiltrate rain. The soil's blowing away at record levels. When you look at people like Gabe Brown and others that are using regenerative methods, they are actually making a profit, and they're planting as many as 17 different types of seeds at a time into their fields using a drill seeder. They never till the soil, and they're able to infiltrate 10 times the water that their neighboring farmers can infiltrate, because it just runs off, because there's no structure to the soil, because it's tilled all the time, and they put all these pest applications, and they're growing one type of crop, usually corn and soybeans. This is not going to end well for the country. So the quicker we as individuals learn to use some of these regenerative methods to build the soil, to deal with the pests naturally, and to create ecosystems. Like, you have different crops, you're building the soil, you've got bees there for pollination. There's a lot of things that you can plant that attract pollinators naturally as well. All those things need to be a part of what you're trying to do to free yourself from what I feel is a quickly failing food system.
Yeah, and throw the curveball in of cooling and shorter growing seasons, shrunken growing seasons because of this grand solar minimum onset and intensification. So a lot of the traditional crops that took us, almost 200 years to figure out where the perfect grow zone for those are, wired in and dialed in the plant and harvest by dates pretty much over the last 100 years. Well, that's all changed ED, and it's continuing to change as we go every single year forward. So the wipeout of almost all the wheat crop in the United States this year, at least half the corn's gone. Brazil lost 50% of its production. Argentina's halting exports of corn and beef. And you look at Australia, they were starting to export, but then the mouse plague, and they lost so much crop because of one of the largest mouse plagues they've had since the mid 1800s. So it just starts to add in, and then the massive, gigantic floods yet again in China, in the same areas that didn't recover from last year's floods in the growing areas. So as we look forward, you're still going to have the same appetite, if you will, for food, calories, tonnage. But where's it going to come from if it's not being grown at the moment? I understand we have some carryover stocks, but how trustworthy do you think the USDA numbers are? Because their mission charter is to stabilize agricultural markets. It's not there to give you the truth. So you got to think about USDA numbers. How truthful are they versus what's really in the, well, they could say there's a huge amount in the silos and the carryover stocks and storage, but how much of that's good? Because I talked to a grain trader who minimum buy, if you're going to, they do delivery on rail. So their minimum order is 12,500 tons before they'll even talk to you and think about getting some carriage arranged for you. They were saying that the amount of corn, of just the black corn, black kernels, and just the craziest degraded quality you've ever seen is getting mixed in with good for export, because farmers are realizing they can empty out their bins, and the old stuff at the back of the bin that wouldn't make it through an American survey as quality for sale, not even at animal feed levels, can get tossed in. And as long as there's only a certain number of kernels in the ratio there, they can still export that overseas. So when I'm starting to hear these kind of things straight off the ground of people who move grain in large quantities, I'm thinking, what's really going on, and how much grain is there truly out there if they're dusting out the old bins where they're throwing black kernel inside there?
Yeah, these are all things that I think people just are not aware of, at least not many out there. I mean, how many times have you heard, yeah, there's failing crops. I don't eat corn and soybeans. People just don't realize how connected those monocrops are to the food system overall. And yeah, there's been a lot of losses in just about every space: wheat, corn, soybeans, tons and tons of fruit orchards just are not there anymore. Just the other day, like I mentioned, I came through a major peach area. Last year, they lost 85%. of all the fruit there. And that was because of a really late cold frost or a hard freeze. And I asked the farmer, he's been there for 30 years, he's never seen anything like it. So these problems are everywhere, and it seems like it's really coming to a head. And on harvesteating.com, I sell different food products, spices. I also have a line of vegan Parmesan cheeses. They're called Thoughtful Harvest. And I have to buy foods in the commodity market to get the ingredients to manufacture these products. So, my vegan cheese is made with almonds, and you're hearing just about daily almond farmers are just ripping their trees out because the almonds are one of the thirstiest crops that there are. They drink a lot of water. So Central Valley, a lot of California farmers, they're just yanking them out of the ground because they only have so much water, and they have to use it where they feel they're going to get the best bang for their buck. So having to buy and function in these markets, the outages are astounding. Some of my spice products, they rely on, I use as many US grown things as possible, but certainly some of it comes from India. And the supplies are just not there. And it's the same thing with packaging. I need packaging to use and sell these products, but it's so sporadic, David. In 2020, I couldn't get any packaging at all, none, because it's plastic packaging, and they were using it for hand sanitizer bottles and plexiglass that we're all covered up in these days. So you couldn't get any packaging. I started to get some a little bit this year, made an initial purchase. We've manufactured these vegan cheeses. They're over at harvesteating.com, and they'll soon be out on Amazon. But now I'm hearing from the packaging supplier, they're telling me, yeah, we can get you more lids maybe in September or October. That doesn't work for somebody in the business. And I know a lot of other food manufacturers, and they're having real problems getting things that you would think are basic. And then, of course, the supply of meat is being really, really curtailed. Having connections to the restaurant industry, like I mentioned earlier. I had a conversation with a chef that I hired, and I think he said it was $10 a pound one day to the next increase in filet mignon prices. A few years ago, the amount of seed potatoes in the Russian River Valley, not there. A lot of cold, so there's difficulties in potatoes. And we used to get really great Idaho potatoes, and we'd make hand-cut French fries at these restaurants that I was running. And these potatoes got smaller and smaller and smaller. And I would read the market reports coming from the food service companies, and the amount of outages and shortages and price increases. And we no longer get this potato, so now we're going to substitute this potato. And these things were beat up, a lot of black marks on them, 2 inches long. Just the quality of the produce and the availability, lettuce shortages. This was happening all through 2020, and I know in 2021. So I think people really need to, number one, wake up about this and start stocking up their house with as much food as possible, and then doing what you're doing. I mean, I put out a podcast the other day on my podcast, a Harvest Eating podcast, urging people to plant perennial bushes, to start gardening, to go and meet a farmer, to find local meat. All these things are available to do, and you really need to kind of wake up and do it before you're in a food line, like you said. I mean, because that can never happen in the United States, of course. But I'm alarmed, and I know I'm in the food industry. I have been for 30 years, and I see what's going on. I know a lot of farmers, and it's a serious situation.
Yeah, and just from I guess a lot of people would be asking the same question. Why would the farmers with the almond plantations decide to rip up their trees instead of just not giving them water, let them possibly go dormant, maybe survive, because one little taproot will survive without water. They pretty much will try to go into their survival mode. Why would the farmers rip the trees up when they know there's a possibility, if rains do come, or if there is some moisture coming in the next few months, just a typhoon or a hurricane comes off the Pacific and moisturizes the area again, those trees could sort of revitalize themselves just enough to stay alive to the next season. I mean, what do they see out in the future that they're tearing up their trees now, that they're almost saying we're out of business, there'll never be any more water again, we're never going to grow anything again? For me, that makes no sense why farmers would rip up their trees.
Yeah, it's scary. And when you look at an almond tree, for instance, you can't plant it and harvest it in a year or 2 years. I mean, these are 5, 6 years to start getting anything. And they have, a good productive life for 15 or 20 years. So they're seeing something we're not with what's going on with water. I know some farmers did go and mechanically shake off the young almonds to help the tree so it doesn't have that stress of producing almonds and just maybe like you said, it stays in the ground alive barely until the next rains come. So that's happened as well. But a lot of them, 400 acres of trees at a time are being ripped out in some areas. And, when you, as a smaller producer like me, I don't buy railroad cars full of almonds. And what happens, you start seeing these bigger producers, they won't sell to the little guy anymore. So if you're not a major customer, you're just pushed to the wayside. I contacted my supplier today, and I'm waiting to hear back, how much supply is there in the market, because I've got to plan to, remanufacture the products. But it's really becoming, at least for me, something that I enjoy doing it. They're great products. The customers love them. I've been selling spices since 2011. I've got thousands of repeat customers, but number one, I'm not going to substitute ingredients because I'm not trying to make $1 billion. So I'm not going to use cheap ingredients just to sell it to somebody. So, somebody emailed me today and they said they like a spice blend. It's called Carolina Competition Barbecue, but some of the ingredients that I use, I just can't get because I use contract grown ingredients. And that's when you make a contract with a farmer and you get a harvest. I don't buy them on the open market. And when you start using ingredient brokers, they don't even know where the food comes from. It's just, yeah, we've got, 1,000 pounds of garlic powder. They can't tell you where it comes from because a lot of it come from China, here and there, all over the place. So I don't do that. And for me, it's losing its luster. I just don't enjoy having to scramble around and substitute to make foods because I really care about what I'm doing. Yeah, it all comes down to the supply, and people think it's endless. They just think that it will never run out. And but if you look back through history, time will tell, and you can see where there's been products. My father-in-law, he's from England, and he was telling me he's 78 years old. He remembers rationing cards. You would go into the stores, and he grew up in Windsor, right near the castle, and you'd have a ration card. And the storekeeper, his grandfather was a storekeeper, and they would, mark your card to show how many eggs you got that day or how much milk, whatever it was. So these are things that, there is historical precedent for it. Just we don't think in the breadbasket of the world here in the United States that it can ever be an issue.
So what are some of the easiest crops to grow, do you think? Like, let's say I'm a beginning gardener, Keith, and I'm listening in and say, well, I'm super excited. I want to go to the store today and buy seeds. One thing, we went to a co-op store this morning, and what used to be a super giant seed rack of, probably 200 different varieties is squeezed down into, you talked about some beets and a few other things, but there's not many seeds left even on the seed racks now as you're going through, because we're coming into the midsummer. It's kind of at the end of planting season, unless you're going to put pumpkins in the ground. But if I'm really excited right now, give me some ideas of what do you think some of the easiest crops are to get started with for just the person who says, I never grew a thing before. Here's my first seed. Now what do I do?
I think every beginning gardener has faced that question and had to make those decisions. And I would first recommend securing seeds, number one, going to a place. And you want to also quickly go over, or I'll go over the difference between open pollinated and hybrid seeds. Now, a hybrid seed that you can buy, you go to Lowe's or Home Depot, they've got all these hybrid seeds there. They do have heirlooms too, but a hybrid seed only grows one time. So you cannot save the seeds from a hybrid plant and get the same exact fruit or vegetable from it, because it won't grow what they call true to type. So for an example, Sweet 100 cherry tomatoes is a great product. It's not genetically modified, it's just a hybrid. So it's been bred to produce a lot of beautiful cherry tomatoes, but you cannot save the seeds. So the smart thing to do is to find the heirloom open pollinated varieties of seeds. So a place like Baker Creek, it's rareseeds.com. That'll be a good thing to put in your show notes. So first of all, get yourself some heirloom seeds that you can save the seed from. But once you start getting some seeds, the first thing I would suggest are perennial trees and bushes. Those take quite a few years. I mean, not a tremendous amount. You can get blueberries in a year or two, but I would plant, I would buy trees and bushes and get those planted first. Things like asparagus that are perennial that come back. And then I would look on the internet and find books about companion planting. And I would plant a polyculture around these crops. But then, you know, some of the best things that we can grow that are easy, potatoes are very easy. I've grown hundreds of linear feet of potatoes and had so many potatoes we didn't know what to do with them, and we were giving them away and storing them. So potatoes can produce a bumper crop. And then you start talking about winter squashes, where you can, you know, in the Carolinas, sweet potatoes grow tremendously well. And you can eat the greens from sweet potatoes. The potatoes store a long time. They're pretty caloric and dense. All the winter squashes are tremendous to grow because those, you're in July, this is the perfect time, at least in your area, to start putting butternut squash and acorn squash, things like that, into the ground. Because if you get 20 or 30 butternut squashes or acorn squashes, you can be eating off those things for months and months. So if you're really interested in this kind of thing, hopefully you have a cool basement that doesn't get a lot of light because you can store these foods. You can also learn about creating a root cellar, which is an excellent thing to do. Basically all the old time things that we used to do, that our parents used to do and grandparents. Fermenting, tremendously important. So therefore things like cabbage, and you can ferment anything, cabbage, tomatoes, carrots, it all ferments well. But if you plant cabbage, those are pretty easy to grow. You're going to want to likely put a cabbage net over them to keep out cabbage worms, but also, again, companion planting. What things can you plant with the cabbage that the bugs like or don't like? And what kind of flowers can you plant in between there to attract ladybugs and other beneficial, because there's a lot of beneficials out there, and that's where you really need to do your study. But something like cabbages, whether you grow them yourselves or you go to a farmer's market and buy 15 or 20 pounds and make sauerkraut. Our refrigerator is filled with sauerkraut. I make it probably 25 pounds at a time. I've got an old German crock, and it's salt and cabbage. That's it. And in 6 weeks, you've got really usable food, and you've turned, you know, cabbage is a healthy thing, but when you ferment it, it makes it a lot more healthy, and it also preserves it. I also ferment all my hot peppers, and I make a hot pepper paste, and it lasts for years. So these are things, strategies that people can use. So number one, you need to get a source of seeds. Then I would start planting perennial trees and bushes. Then I would plant crops that you like that have further value down the line. Like I just mentioned with fermenting. What about tomatoes, where you can make tomato sauce and can that? Squashes that can be harvested and will store well. Then another thing, you know, you talk about making an investment in yourself. Rather than buying the new shiny bass boat, what about buying a food dehydrator or an all-American pressure canner or a food dehydrator? These are things, or glass jars. I know you've recently talked about canning jars. You cannot wait until you need them, because when you need them, they're not going to be there. You need to invest in them now because they're not going to go bad. Canning jars and lids are a great thing. When I was filming my TV show, one of our title sponsors was a company that made reusable canning lids. So investing in these kind of ancillary supplies to help take the harvest that you get from your own land, from your neighbors, from farmers markets, from CSAs, and you can turn these things into other foods down the road. But it's about education after all. There's a book out there. It's called Jam It, Pickle It, Cure It. And it's basically a book filled with home economics projects that surround food, whether it's making your own ketchup or easy cheeses. I mean, if you have a source of raw dairy in your state there, you can buy raw dairy. And I'll provide a link to that as well. There's an online site that shows you exactly what's going on with raw dairy in all 50 states. There's a lot more states than you would imagine where you could go directly to the farmer, not the supermarket, and buy higher quality, well created foods like raw milk. You have to do your homework when you're dealing with raw milk. You can't be buying it from somebody that doesn't care for the pastures, doesn't know how to handle the milk. I mean, those are important questions to ask. Are they doing testing? But those are foods. Earlier, you talked about nutritional content. You're going to get a lot more nutritional benefit from raw milk or homemade yogurt than pasteurized milk. So this is a pretty, it's an organic thing from the ground up, and you need to look at all your foods and start making a list. Seeds, bushes, equipment, canning supplies, connections, all these things, gardening tools.
Yeah, that was a good, thinking about root cellars. How about a Faraday root cellar? Because a lot of people are talking about Faraday cages, but at the same time storing things. So do you think it's a possibility to do a quote unquote Faraday root cellar, trying to combine different systems together and, looking at what you can grow in terms of the flowers in your garden that are also medicines that could be turned into medicines, instead of just being a flower that either attracts or repels different types of predatory wasps that, lay their eggs inside those caterpillars. And if you think you see a pretty white butterfly, for me, that's terrifying because I know they're laying eggs to go eat up all my vegetables. So, thinking about flowers that you could plant at the same time that then could be dried and turned into different types of medicinals, whether it be an aqueous ultrasonic separation, and then you could store that in alcohol, or, that's why I have some of the beeswax out there. I'm just starting and learning in my very first year of trying to use beeswax to combine for salves and balms, lip, these kind of things. So I'm getting into it more on the medicinal side of things too, of growing for medicine. But the food is your own medicine, but also it could be in terms of antibiotics, the most famous being marigolds. Boil that down into a slow boiled tincture, and then it's an antibiotic drop there. I mean, there's some really simple basics, but again, the marigolds are great for getting pests out of your garden. So at the end of the year, there's a lot of benefits to be able to harvest different flowers, etc.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and that's something I've studied. I'm not an expert in it, but I talked earlier about planting trees and bushes. I know a lot of people that grow elderberries, which can be made into a syrup. It's an immune booster, really popular right now. I know when elderberry syrup was flying off the shelves in record numbers, it was actually hard to get for a little bit. But you can grow elderberries, and there's a lot of different varieties, and they're very easy to grow. It's, again, a perennial, and you get a great harvest from them, and you can make medicine with them. But yeah, I definitely believe food is medicine, and not putting chemicals into your body to start with is really important. Everybody wants their immune system up. You look at some of these things in the store, and there'll be 60, 70 ingredients listed on the label. You have to eat whole foods and really avoid the center of the supermarket. That way you don't need all these medicines. But yeah, it's a good point you make. There are a lot of things in nature, and a lot of people that are really smart about crafting wild edibles and turning them into all different types of tinctures and creams. There's just myriad of examples of that stuff. I need to learn about that a little more myself.
It's a never-ending journey. I mean, you could learn as much as you could, and then you come back to, you might say, the woman who is sprinkling 7 all over the plants, but the amount of knowledge she has as a gardener for how many years she'd been doing for 50 years, and she can still learn as well. And you can never know too much. You could be alive for 500 years and still be learning about how to do something better as you move through this whole hands in the soil holistic way to get the highest yield and companion plant, save, store, all these things. It really will be a never-ending journey if you decide to step on that first step on for the rest of your life to surround yourself with food and make that part of your life, your lifestyle. It can't be just like, hey, I'm going to do it. It's got to be incorporated in your lifestyle. Some people play music, but it's got to be part of the lifestyle where you go in your garage and it's full of tools because they're, some of them still have mud on them because we're, out there planting the last couple of days. It's that, continuous incorporation of that skill set into your life.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I'm a big fan of the Austrian School of Economics, and there's a gentleman that I've followed for years. His name is Jim Rogers. He's an older dude.
I know Jim.
Yeah, and he's famous for telling people you need to become a farmer. So your point about it being a lifestyle, I mean, living healthfully and becoming more in touch with your food supply, it's not something you do, Saturday morning. And this is something that you need to kind of become engrossed in. And people, like you mentioned, musicians, they don't become excellent musicians because they play 3 or 4 hours a month. I mean, they dedicate themselves to it. When you're talking about growing food and increasing food security and building, a homestead and just more security in general, you need to be reading about it, buying books about it. I mean, when I drove here to do this interview with you, I was listening to a podcast called Epic Gardening, and it's short, very well produced. And lately they've been talking a lot about perennial crops. I mean, so each day I'm trying to learn more and more, like I mentioned with regenerative agriculture. I've never done it on a large scale. Hopefully I will one day, but these are things that you can learn about, and every day I learn something else about food, whether it's how to, well, I've been making bacon a long time, but how to make your own bacon, or how to make, medicine from plants, how to sharpen a tool that you need, how to, change the oil in your tractor. Any of these things, they take time and practice, and I think we need to put a little more attention on becoming farmers and learning to take part in our food supply. Really important.
With that being said, so we're talking about food, a little bit of food storage again. You mentioned easiest things to grow. Now, walk me through, give me a couple ways of, okay, I'm a total beginner. I'm going to go to the store today. I'm going to purchase something. You can still get canning jars because almost everywhere we went to today, from the supermarket to the farm co-ops, just down to the hardware store, everybody's got jars. Not large. They're all real small. The biggest ones we saw were like quart jars, but I like those half-gallon size or even a full gallon where you can put a lot of mass into it. Okay, so the jars behind me, great. That's one way to store some stuff, but what are some other real easy ways for people to put something up for a little bit longer to be able to store it? I'm interested to learn this myself.
I'll touch on a few things, but let's just start with grains. So I buy grains to store. Now, whole grains, wheat, even corn, oats, these type of things will store a long time, not as flour, but as whole grains. So find a source of these that are non-GMO and organic, and I buy them in 50-pound sacks, and I store everything in my pantry that would enable me, when you go to the supermarket, you want to bake bread. So maybe you'll get bread flour, whole wheat flour, all-purpose flour. So I mimic those grains in my storage, and I buy them, like I said, from an organic source, and then I put them in Mylar bags. Those are very heavy-duty bags that I buy on the internet in bulk, and enough that it'll fit inside of a 5-gallon bucket. Now, 5-gallon buckets have become expensive, but you can go to certain stores and bakeries and they throw them out. So one of them is a sub shop that I go to, and they used to just give them to you. Now they sell them to you for $3, but I buy, 10, 15 of these things per month. And then I buy grains and I pour them into Mylar bags. I put oxygen absorbers in them and I seal the bag and store it in a cool or climate controlled. You don't want to put this stuff in an attic or a garage. And, we have probably 450 pounds of grain stored. That's one thing. What about if you can go and make jam? So I mentioned apricots earlier. You can buy some apricots, one of the simplest jams to make. You just simply take the apricots, you remove the pit, you put them in a pot, you add some sugar, some lemon juice, a little bit of pectin, you bring that up to a boil and you cook it for about an hour or so. Use a potato masher, and you mash it all up. Make sure it's at a nice hard boil. You put it into your canning jars, put the lid on them, and then you don't even need a pressure canner for that. You just put it in a water bath. So it's like a large spaghetti boiling water pot, and you put your jars in there and you process them for 20 or 30 minutes. Look online for something called the Ball, B-A-L-L, Ball Blue Book. It's sort of the Bible of canning, and you can make your own jam. Other things that you can do that are simple are you can make your own yogurt, either with store-bought milk or with local milk. It's very easy to make it. You just take, a gallon of milk and you'll add some yogurt to it, like 1 cup of yogurt. You have to make sure it's the type that doesn't have corn syrup and flavorings, not the Yoplait, but the stuff that has actual bacteria in it. And you inoculate the milk with that, and then you'll cook it for a period of time, and then it sits. What we used to do is put it into quart jars, and we would do 6 at a time and put them into an igloo cooler, and we'd fill it halfway up with 190-degree water, cover it, and let it sit for 18, 20 hours, and you'd come back and you could turn it upside down and it was solidified yogurt. So there's lots of things that you can do. Again, these home economic projects to put up and store food. Flour and things like that don't store very well. I mean, we keep quite a bit of it on hand. What is that? Oh, grain mill. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a hand crank grain mill. So I'm going to be trying a couple different ones. I got barley, wheat, spelt, and I'm going to try to grind through a few of these and see. Oh, I have sorghum and buckwheat as well. So some of these more ancient grains, like amaranth's way too small to consider to use this anyway. But millet, again, a little too small for this, but I'm more into the ancient grains as well. So I'm starting to think about flours and which one will grind better. And how much does it really take to grind down to be able to create a loaf of bread? And how much calorific output will that take? I mean, it's great that we can grind something here. I haven't even unboxed this yet. This is one of the things I want to do is put this on the workbench and grind out a bunch and see how long it'll take to, get 3 cups of flour.
Yeah.
And if I can do different combinations of grind as well between, some barley and some hard red winter wheat. I got some soft white. I got a couple different kinds of wheat like you do, and then just the different hardy grains. Because at the co-ops around here, when you buy a bag, because I have a registered farm, you go in, it's 50-pound bag. That's kind of the minimum size you would buy. So it's quite easy to scoop out a couple quarts of, grain. But how long will it really take you to hand grind that? Because I've seen a fair few videos. It comes out, but it comes out really slow. And if there's any way I could put a motor onto this thing, can you motorize a hand-powered tool? Just some of these things just to experiment with. I'm not really sure, but the more you make the mistake, the better you learn how to do it next time. And eventually you're gonna, come up with something that could be usable in something real simple fashion. Maybe using a house fan with some sort of belt on this thing to make it spin faster. Who knows? I'm going to experiment with a few things.
Yeah, well, I've been down that road, and because of the television show and the website videos, a lot of manufacturers have reached out through the years and wanted to get their stuff pictured on the television set or in the video. So I've had an opportunity to work with a lot of mills, and I've had 2 or 3 hand crank mills, and yeah, they work. There's no question about it. But the amount of effort it takes is extraordinary to get enough to make some. One of the videos in the Food Storage Feast course, it's a whole wheat Pullman loaf, and it's a loaf pan that anybody can get on Amazon. It's called the USA Pan Company. It's a really great pan, and I use that to make bread in the course. Now, I've done just what you've talked about, is I wanted to see what it would take to grind it by hand. So I was fortunate enough, we lived in Montana for a while, and our neighbor literally was the producer of the grain maker, and it's a big red grain mill. It's hand cranked, but it's manufactured in a way that on the big wheel you can put a belt on it and either connect it to an electric motor, or you can even do it on a stationary bike. So people will do that, just sit on a stationary bike and pedal their way through a couple of pounds of grain. I also purchased, I've had several electric ones, and some of them are not very high quality, but I have an Austrian made, or German, I think it's German or Austrian made. It's called Como, K-O-M-O. So I paid $500 for a Como grain mill, and I spent extra money to get the one in black walnut because that's my favorite wood. So it's a very pretty mill, but it does a tremendous job. So I will make this loaf of bread. We usually make it once or twice a week. Sometimes if there's a new neighbor or something, or an older person, I make bread to give away. And it's 34 ounces of flour that need to be ground. So we'll put it into this mill, and it literally just takes 3 or 4 minutes to grind it with the electric mill. So it's very, very convenient. And I use different grains, like you mentioned. One of my favorites to put in bread is rye. So rye is excellent. It's also great for making sourdough starter. So we make sourdough breads as well as yeasted breads, but I'll use rye flour and then spring white wheat and hard winter wheat all in one bread, and mix it all together. And what I do to make it more healthful, if it's a sourdough, it's going to go at least 24 hours before it's baked. But even when I make a yeasted bread, I'll let it ferment for 24 hours. And that completely changes the texture, the flavor, the nutritional situation inside, because a lot of people struggle with gluten. And you could be using organic or conventional grains, but they still have gluten. So if you have those things fermenting for a long period, the bacteria in the fermentation breaks down some of these proteins that are hard to digest and makes them less of a problem. I mean, there's a lot of studies. I just read a big long article out of Europe the other day where true sourdough bread fermented a minimum of 12 hours is safe for people that are diagnosed with celiac disease to eat. So if somebody that's just sensitive to it, if you're finding breads that have long fermentation, those are much better. And these are, again, going back to your comment earlier, they're more nutritionally dense. And these are things that we need to learn at home, because anybody can make, a 3-hour bread, but those quick fermented breads are not nearly as healthy. And also some of the ancient grains that you mentioned, there's quite a few ancient grains out there, and I do store some of those ancient grains. They're a lot more difficult to get because they're not as economical to grow. Italy, they're growing quite a few of them. And these are the wheats of the Bible. These are things that the Roman soldiers used for fuel, thousands of years ago. But they don't grow as dense as modern hybridized wheat. But there's a lot of varieties of those, and you can find them on the internet, and they do taste a lot better. And I store those grains myself. I think they're wonderful. I've also messed around quite a bit with buckwheat, making gluten-free breads with buckwheat. So yeah, there's a lot to learn out there, David, for sure.
I have two different types of millet. I have the Japanese silver millet, and then I have the German millet. The Japanese silver millet, just like a rocket ship out. The birds loved it. The German millet, I don't know, maybe it was the rainfall, maybe it was the temperature, it didn't grow nearly as well. But the buckwheat, it's that for the pollinator habitat for the bees as well. And, if you mow that down, it'll grow right back. So you can get a double crop out of that. I'm not talking about bringing it all the way to grain, but bringing it up to flower, let the flowers fall off where they start to grain head. And then if you cut that silage for animals, but just try to bring it up for the flowers for the bees to have, because they come into the dearth in this time of the year when there's really not a lot of, pollen out there, not a lot of nectar flowing. So, bees get incredible hungry. But to be able to have a grain that you could put out there, even if it's a small amount, and then after the second turn right now, I am going to let it come to full head, and then I'll try to harvest that. I don't have anything to harvest it with right now, so I'm just still in the process of okay, so we could talk. It's easy to go buy a 50-pound bag of grain from a farm co-op that's nicely dried and wrapped in a paper bag, sewn up, and that's great. But what are you going to do when you come up with 3 tons of grain by yourself in a wagon behind you? Then what? Where do you put it? And this is where you come back to, oh no, you got all these weevils and different kind of pests that are going to get in there. So it would be the same thing with a cabbage. Okay, 2 heads of cabbage, 3 heads of cabbage. That's pretty easy. Okay, 2 tons of cabbage, now what? So when you think about when you're scaling it up, then it comes into a whole different ball game of trying to think how to store and preserve things on a larger scale.
Yeah, I just recently watched a video of a guy that wanted to grow his own wheat, and I think he was in South Carolina. It's a very humid climate, can make it a little more difficult. And he showed the entire process of planting the wheat, letting it grow, harvesting it, threshing it. It takes a lot of effort to do that. And yeah, you're going to work for it. I think it's an important crop to grow. I've never threshed wheat myself, so I know it's a process. And like you said, if you have harvested these things, what do you do with it all? Well, I think you use some of these techniques we talked about: canning, fermenting, processing, drying, but also we need to work together as a community. And there's going to be people around you that have things that you don't have that may need the things that you have. So giving away bread, giving away cabbages, hey, you've got some peppers, I've got tomatoes. These are the things that we need to do, because if we don't have community, it's going to be difficult to really get through what I think is coming. I think we need to have strong neighborhood connections. And one of the things I've always done, no matter where I've lived, is it seems to always have a lot of elderly people around. I've always brought food and shared food with neighbors and friends. I mean, we lived at one point near some older Southern people, and I would bake bread for them, and they absolutely loved it. And they would show up at the house and give us strawberries. They would give us apples, all different types of things that were grown, on their place, or friends and family, or just sources that they knew. So that's definitely an important thing to keep in mind, is building community. But yeah, it's a learning process for sure. And you mentioned some of those ancient grains. I keep spelt, which is an ancient grain. I keep some einkorn, and I keep kamut. And there's growers up in Montana that grow kamut or kamut, however you pronounce it. So these ancient grains are unique to cook with. I'll tell a story. When we were filming an episode, there is a gentleman that I think people need to know about. His name is Glenn Roberts, and his company is called Anson, A-N-S-O-N, Anson Mills. He's in Columbia, South Carolina. And we filmed the TV episode with him. And this guy stores all varieties of ancient seeds. And he's a very important person for our food supply. And he's saved so many of the old corns and wheats and oats, you name it, he saves it. And I've been in his warehouse before, and it was a little scary, because he was telling me that some of the big GMO seed companies, they don't want this guy in existence. So they're always trying to send him. He keeps several addresses, and they're trying to send him crops to then put out a news story that his sources are contaminated with GMO. So they send him seeds that are GMO seeds. Oh, would you look at these and test these? And he'll test everything, but he tests it in the laboratory away from his stash of stuff, and he's had that happen multiple times. So when we were in his warehouse, there's no sign on the building. You would never know it's there. It's an old metal building, and when we walked in there, it was creepy, David. There were probably 200 7-8 foot long white chest freezers, and he turned on these lights, and you didn't know what was going to be in these chests, but he would go and lift them up, and they'd be filled with different corns and wheats and all these things from all over the country. And he'll send out seeds for free to farmers to grow them, and he'll send them to multiple areas for diversity. He won't send them to Kansas, so to speak, where they could get tornadoes. He'll send them to many different states, and whoever can deliver a harvest, that's the real thing. So he knows what seeds he sent. When the harvest comes back, he requests a sample, he tests it in his laboratory, and if it's the real thing, then it can make it into his supply. But one of the things he had was an ancient grain it's a whole wheat called red fife. And when I was there, he went into one of the coolers, he scooped it out, and then he's got these very old stone mills, and he's very careful about the way he grinds it to avoid heat, because when you're grinding, it creates a tremendous amount of friction. So he uses stones, and he injects, as it's grinding, liquid nitrogen onto the stones to keep the temperature below 100 degrees. So I had a recipe for whole wheat bread using the best store-bought whole wheat flour I could find. And, it rose, we ate it, it was never great. And then I made the exact same recipe with wheat that he ground for me. I made it the next day. And this thing, David, it was night and day. It was 3 times the size. And I'm pretty precise. I don't use volumetric. I use very sensitive scales. So I know about baking with my chef background. And the bread that I can make with his freshly ground heirloom grain like that, it wasn't even the same product. And then when I ran out of it, because he gave me 5 pounds, and I switched back, immediately the bread went back to that super dense, nasty stuff. So there is a difference in these foods, and there's people out there that are doing some really great work. So I could talk about this stuff all day, as you might imagine. It's exciting to me, and I'm very interested in the food system and just finding great sources.
Yeah, that kamut, that's one I really don't think I've ever run across. And, even finding spelt is like a wow, you like get excited at whoa, look what I found, buried treasure somewhere. And, you talk to, there's so many food allergies that are happening today. So I find myself, this is my own, when I eat a lot of the, shall we say, canned foods that are stored for, you could 3-year can of beans or whatever. When I start to eat a lot of that, I notice that my skin's quite different, that I start to feel just non-digestion in there. There's things are hanging around much longer because I'm putting so much fresh green. I definitely know how my body operates and how long it takes to, before my stomach starts grumbling again, before I get hungry. Yeah, I'm using baking soda with water to try to keep the alkalinity up there. But, you know, once you start eating and nibbling on those foods, a lot of preservatives and chemical factory stuff, you really, really, really feel it different in your body, the way your digestion performs and the way that the skin is as well. But then, you know, you bring that over into the grains and how many people have wheat allergies and corn allergies because it's all GMO. But then, you know, you come into the millets, they're not really GM'd so much yet. That's why that Japanese silver millet's not a GM variety. But, you know, coming down into an emergency situation where you might not have a choice at that point, you always want to have a choice, because I don't want to be at the behest of somebody feeding me only factory processed GM, and that's all I have to stay alive on. And if you start to get sick, then there's no other choice, then that's not a choice. So to have something stored up and seeing into the future a little bit, this crystal ball of where we're moving and knowing your own bodies, knowing the people around you closest, what kind of food allergies do they have, what resonates, because you don't want to buy a bunch of stuff that nobody's going to eat or they're not really fond of the taste. You know, if you make a huge pot of something, but nobody, like myself, I'm not a fan of onion soup really. So if you made a gigantic pot of onion soup, I'd be like, all right, I'll eat a little bit, but it's not like I'd devour the entire pot. So you get all these, so many facets to think about when you're trying to prep out and store and, you know, create foods that are healthy and nutritious. But at the same time, you know, there's all these different, there's not just a single balance on a scale. There's multiple scales and different dimensions moving during this thing that you need to think about, and which ones store the longest. You know, these pumpkins are great. Pumpkin season's coming up. You know, you put the straw up there and put them on the racks, and you can keep those for months, half a year. But what if things go bad really quickly? I mean, you can't keep lettuce that long. So it's just so many things to continuously think about. And, you know, we could fill up 6 notebooks between you and I of these different things that might need to be thought about moving into these changes here.
One of the things when I created this course, Food Storage Feast,
I'm interested in, you know, showing the people watching the interview tonight, where can they go to get this? Where can they go to start being self-sufficient on their own, self-sufficiently, not having to rely on other people, but learning the skills, watching it, doing it, practicing it? Like, where do you find this course you're talking about?
If you visit foodstoragefeast.com, you'll find a link to it. Also, if you visit harvesteating.com and look on the top of the site, there's a link right to the course. I'll provide a coupon code for you to help your viewers get a discount to get into the course. And once they're inside, there's a lot of written information in there that shows and really gives people an idea, because, you know, maybe the entire food system doesn't collapse. Maybe we don't, you know, get hit by a nuclear bomb, but what about a job loss? What about a hurricane? Like friends of mine in Florida a few years ago, I mean, these people I've known for a long time, and I visit their house, and you look in the pantry and they have children. There's not 2 days worth of food in there during a perfect scenario. And a couple of years ago, one of the hurricanes went through Florida, and this guy was telling me there was no bread left in the public supermarket. Most of the stuff was empty 2 days before the storm. People were getting in fistfights at the gas station. They were brawling for bottled water at Home Depot. And these things happen. It doesn't necessarily need to be a major event, just a normal event. So I put this course together to help people that they need to be home during those things, and helping their neighbors and you know, their friends, and not being in a panic. So all the reasons that you might want to store food. And then it goes into a lot of other things, like you mentioned earlier, you know, an electric or a hand cranked grinder. We talk about how to cook food in an emergency, because there's a lot of easy ways to cook food in an emergency if there's a power outage. Different stoves that we tested. Like, I will regularly cook on little butane stoves. Like, I'll go and cook bacon out there. I'll cook a lot of things out there, even during a good time. After we give you a pretty good idea of why you need to store food, then we start to break down the ingredients one by one, the major ingredients. So rice and beans, for instance, oats, wheat, corn. We talk about all these things, about which varieties store better, ways to store them, and then we offer recipes and videos with those foods. Now, you mentioned, you know, not wanting to eat big nasty things, and this is why I encourage people, and they have been doing it since I put this course up on the internet. You don't want to wait until something bad happens to learn how to make these foods. You want to be regularly doing it. These are good for everyday use. I serve this food to my family on a regular basis. This isn't something that I put off in the corner. This is part of our daily meal. And nowadays with food inflation, you can stretch your budget out a lot by cooking these dishes. So we talk about all the foods that you can store and how you can mix things that you can get now, because we're not in a crisis now. Like you said earlier, there's still a lot of food in the market. But I think it does make sense for the average family, instead of having that typical, meat and three, which you know about being down there in the South, a big plate of meat with a couple of vegetables. Why not have rice and beans and chicken? Or why not make your own cornbread? One of the great recipes, something called Kettle Cornbread. And I grind my own corn. It's organic, dried corn. I put it through the mill. And then I grind some whole wheat flour. But I also add butter and raw dairy to it, and a little bit of salt to it. And I make this, it's hard to call it a bread. It's almost like a cake. It is delicious. So it's a kettle corn bread or cake. And the kids and my kids' friends, every time they come over, the first thing, do you have any of that cornbread? So this isn't prison gruel. This is stuff that you want to eat. We have Asian dishes in there. We've got game dishes. So a lot of hunters up in Montana. We've got dishes that feature elk and deer meat, lots of soups, all different types of rice dishes, scones made out of oats, all different types of foods and dishes in there. So it's kind of a crash course of using common ingredients with, dried ingredients, all the grains, the flours, the rices, the beans, both canned and fresh, tuna fish, you name it. And then you mix it with fresh ingredients that I hope you guys are finding sources of, and you make really great meals that are nutritious, that are exciting. So those are ways to add flavor. And you've traveled around the world. Some of these other cultures, if you compare the average American palate, particularly the Southern palate, it can be very heavy and sort of one-sided. A lot of fried foods, a lot of, neutral flavored things, just kind of, roasted pork all the time. That could be a little boring, but when you start to add in other aromatic vegetables, herbs, spices, it takes average food and makes it exciting. So the things that I have done in the course, I regularly use them. I make these dishes all the time at my house. They were tested on kids. So people ask, well, will my kids eat it? My kids eat it, and they're used to really fine foods, and they'll eat these things, and they love them. My son, I've got to tell him, no, I'm not making you rice and beans again. You need to eat, this or that. The recipes can be downloaded as PDFs. So we try to make the information, easily accessible in case there was a time when you couldn't get on the internet. We're also going to be turning it into a book. As you mentioned earlier, I'm a cookbook author. It's called the Harvest Eating Cookbook. It is available on Amazon. So we're going to turn the Food Storage Feast into some kind of a book that anybody that joins the course will get a copy of when it's done. It's been in the works a long time. But it's something that I want to do. But overall, I just think it is a very good education. We also show freeze-dried and dehydrated foods in there. It's not solely that. There's one section on freeze-dried foods, probably has 15 or 20 videos, beef, the vegetables, dried carrots, onions, all those things, bell peppers, tomato powder. We show how to make lots of different foods with those, split peas, bean soups, all of that. That's important too. But I try not to use that stuff when I don't have to. So it's something that I think, going into what we're going into, particularly with the food inflation, this is where I'm very sensitive. I have 3 kids. We have an above average income, so we're not super worried about groceries. But I know a lot of families that have lots and lots of kids, and it can be expensive. And, I was at the store the other day. The little lousy steak was like $18. This thing was, 1/4-inch thick, wasn't grass-fed, wasn't good at all. I'm seeing the prices of food and dairy really go up, and I love to, like at the end of the meal, the other day it's 5 of us in my family, and they had 2 friends over, so there were 7 people, and I made this dish for them. I think it was my confetti rice. I had some chicken thighs grilled, and then a side of beans, and then a dessert that came out of the course as well. I think it was a rice pudding. And when they got done, I said, how was the food? They loved it. People were getting seconds. and we fed everyone for like $3.17 each. So these are strategies that are really valuable.
Yeah, and I like the thought that it's not prison gruel, because and unless you've bought a lot of foods to store up to get prepped out, most idea of people of living it through some sort of prolonged grid down or prolonged supply chain disruption is MREs 3 times a day, and they can't get out of that vision of they're going to eat the same thing 3 meals a day. Why would you have ever consider doing that when you have so much abundance around? If you're prepared, so you could have pancakes in the morning, you could have eggs or powdered milk or whatever, even if you got access to the dairies and access to, the further you are in the farm country, the better you are, because you're stuck in the city, you're going for powdered milk. You're out here in the countryside, you're going down to your local neighbor who does have a dairy farm and getting real milk from the cow. It's all relative. So where's your location at? Are you in a city? Are you in the suburb? Are you out in the rural area? Are you way out in farm country? Because you could be in a rural area. I mean, you could be in the middle of like a pine forest somewhere, in Montana. No, we're not even remotely close to any farms, but you're still super rural. And depending if you're rural and in farmland. So there's a whole bunch of variables to think about, but prison gruel is not on my menu in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, no, and it's not on mine either. And we're a family that loves soup, for instance. And I grew up. My mom is Italian. She actually recently passed. She was 93, almost 94, and she definitely quoted and said her longevity was because she ate soup every day. And soup is just one great example of. And you can combine fresh ingredients with pantry staples like I recommend in the course and make giant pots of soup that are filled with nutrition, fiber, vegetables, meats, healthy bone broths. These are things that it's a great skill to have. And we make a large pot of soup, and I'll make a white bean soup, for instance. I'll use heirloom beans. Sometimes I'll use freeze-dried onions in there, but celery, carrot, onions, herbs from the garden. I'll go and put a bunch of kale into it. Old bread, I'll chop it up and make breadcrumbs. I mean, not breadcrumbs, but bread cubes that are toasted with garlic and olive oil. I'll put those in there. Parmesan cheese, all kinds of things that make these bowls of soup that it's a meal. You don't have anything else. Maybe you have dessert afterwards, but we serve this at our house all the time. And a big giant pot of soup like that, it can be made for, I don't know, $8, $10 maybe. And you can serve 5 people 3 times with it. And you're not suffering, you're enjoying it. I mean, it's gourmet food, it's delicious. All kinds of texture, little diced tomatoes, onions, garlic. These are simple strategies to get into. And, you mentioned where you are in the country. At one point, I was living on a farm, and my neighbor had 150 acres. He had a great big house, loads of cattle, all the room in the world. And we were out in the country, 6 miles out in the country. The wife would put the kids in the car in the morning, drive into town, and buy them Bojangles for breakfast. They'd come back and they'd sit there and eat Bojangles. And I mean, I'm just sitting there thinking, I don't understand this. And you go into their pantry, these are very, very well-educated, well-off people. Nothing, an old thing of cornmeal, some ice pops in the freezer, maybe a, Swanson's breakfast sausage, just no food. And you can't, if you're in that kind of mindset where you're constantly running to the store, running to fast food, you're not going to be healthy. You're wasting a lot of money. There's no enjoyment in eating that stuff. I mean, I tried one time. I was at some kind of a church event, and they had Bojangles biscuits. I don't know what was on it. I took one bite of that thing. It was scary. I mean, I can't eat that kind of food, and I don't think anybody should. So learning how to make these kind of dishes and these old school soups and stews, they feed a lot of people. It stretches your budget, and it's real food. So very important.
Yeah, gourmet food and a grid down. And again, if you had cornmeal and you have yeast and you have a large container, you can ferment that. And if you have a still, you can make your own alcohol. Just saying. We are in the South down here with the moonshine,
No, I know.
Just throwing it out.
Trust me, I've had some videographers that were Southern boys, and we would film Harvest Eating TV shows, and these guys would pull out little mason jars of this clear liquid for me.
Quart jars, yeah.
Yeah, serious stuff.
And I hope you did get a bunch of useful information, you know, because we could have talked about all the nasty things going on, but there you can get enough of that. You can get a basket full and then some by just going to your favorite news channel. So we thought we'd keep it on a light note today, try to give incredible value to help you and your families get prepared through these changes that are not coming anymore. Forget the coming, they're here now. It's manifesting now. It's going through the motion now. There's no more will it, it's here. If you haven't seen that yet, I'm sorry, you're not looking, or you're cognitively putting that to the side there, like I don't want to deal with it. One of those two, but the changes are here. Dealing with it is another thing. You can, you know, face it head on, grab the bull by the horns, get excited about the lifestyle changes that are upon us, knowing that you might have more freedom in many different ways in terms of your food sovereignty and being able to live in a little bit healthier, more in balance with your natural surroundings, because these changes are coming. Like the old lifestyle, we're not going back there. So the changes that are here, you can embrace them, you can fear them, you can cower from them and try to take your mind back to the old world, which will not exist again in our lifetimes, nor for, you know, the rest of many more generations in the future. So it's all how you perceive the moments now moving forward, and to be able to put your fingers in the earth and grow your own food and take that same food and then be able to put it into your stomach within hours or minutes, or, you know, a short amount of time after you pick it or cure it. Something very different in that, something incredibly fulfilling that you can't get by going to a supermarket and buying it. Boy, it's just opening a can. It's so remotely different. It's just being on a trampoline or getting into a space shuttle and launching. It's about the equivalent difference of something like that.
I just wanted to say that I've been following your work for a long time. I'm not somebody that will quote somebody else without looking back and seeing, and I've watched a lot of things that you've talked about for going on 5 years now. And your research and the things that you've talked about, they are coming true. I've spoken with the farmers. The weather things are spot on. And I just wanted to mention, you know, you talk about being self-sufficient. So back in January of 2020, I was reading international headlines about the virus and seeing lockdowns and shutdowns. And I remember telling people that I work with that this is coming here, and they laughed at me. But 6 weeks later, we shut down a resort that I was running as the food and beverage director. It was closed for quite a long time. So these things can happen. When we were locked down, we didn't need to go to the store. We didn't need to panic about toilet paper. I was like, this, you know, being prepared and having a deep pantry, this works, because we had all the things, not just food. We had all the toiletries that we put away, but we were eating great meals at home. Yeah, I dug into some of our long-term stuff, but we had amazing meals, pasta dishes, breads, desserts, all kinds of food. We went into the freezer and had grass-fed meat in there. So this is really helpful stuff. And, you know, I was patting myself on the back because I never really needed to use it, so to speak, before. I mean, I definitely recommend rotating through stored foods. But when we were locked down in 2020, we were home over a month, and we were cooking a lot of food because going to the supermarket was a major pain in the neck. So we really got to put it into use, and I really appreciate you giving me the time. And it's been interesting to get to know you, and I think we're on similar paths. So I wish you well with all your preparations and the channel. And if anybody needs to contact me, just go to harvesteating.com or the Instagram.com/harvesteating. And I can be reached at keithsnow@gmail.com. So I'm out there and willing to help where I can. So thanks a lot, David.
And before we sign off here, you know, harvesteating.com, there's an enormous amount of free resources on there. I was just, you know, going back to the site while you're finishing up, because I was looking at the recipes while you were talking. And what do you have? Like 12, 15 recipes right there on one of the drop-down menus that people can click on and jump in, and it links back to the video so you can watch how it's done. I mean, there's beyond anything else, the amount of free resources to get you started to fingers in on food storage, food preps, and then being able to cook something that is tasty, that's made from all the storable foods right here, harvesteating.com. So, excuse me, I wanted to make sure that everybody was aware that there's a huge gamut of information on there. And the only reason I'll finish with this thought, the only reason I know and could say with some certainty about how these changes were going to unfold, I just followed the cycles. In previous grand solar minimums, they did quite good reconstructions over the last 50 or 60 years of where it got cold. And once you started to see the same events started to happen in the same exact places again, with the same exact circumstance where the sun is going into a prolonged period of low solar activity for the next 2 solar cycles, it's just cycles, literally cycles. And once you find the cycle pattern, and you can give it maybe a soft start date somewhere, then you would look for the periphery information of, okay, the outliers where it would start to snow and rain in Morocco along the east coast and the west coast of Morocco on the Atlantic side. And sure enough, these things started to ping off. Algeria got an enormous amount of rainfall. So when I started to research, like, well, maybe Algerian crops will increase if they're getting more rainfall. And then, you start to follow all these crop yields from Tunisia. And all these areas had record grain harvest for the last 3 years. And you start to see desert screening, and you just follow the patterns. And once you get the patterns set, then you can say, well, if it intensified at this quickness, then we should look for losses along these bands, because they've mapped this out for the last at least very solid 3 cycles, possibly if you want to consider the late antique little ice age with that information, approximately 535 AD, about the volcanic eruptions and the sulfur dioxide drifting, and then the ash particulates across the Mediterranean area that really collapsed. That was the nail in the coffin for the Roman Empire, knowing that food shortages were then as well. So if you start to look and you find some of these same areas, some of the same volcanoes, some of the same cold and record cold, or increasing or decreasing precipitation along these areas, when you can get massive charts for all this stuff going back 3, 4, 5,000 years, I like to get on the 2,500 year chart. This whole climate debate on the last 50 years of climate, or even our last 120, does nobody any good, because you're dismissing the last 3,000 years of climate data where the cycles are really repeatable. And you can start to it's this simple. If you got a 3,000 year chart, you can just circle the high points or the low points, whatever it is for moisture, drought, or temperature, or whatever it is. And then you'll start to see the pattern, and then you just map them up. And if you use a logarithmic scale, you can see the time duration between the high points or low points. And then you go, wait a second. No, wait. Whoa. Great resets here. Cryptocurrencies here. And we're spinning into another one of these low solar activities that's going to reset everything anyway. So let me see. What's going to be the most important thing during this time? Your ability to grow food, your ability to trade food, and your safety. And then you start to see these repeating patterns and cycles in history. But now it's pretty much in earnest now, the beginning point, either last year, or maybe if you would like to slide into the beginning of this year, which I think is a little late, I would put the start date of this grand solar minimum with the effects that are affecting society in earnest at 2019 to 2020. Now, as we start to progress through this, we got about 13 to 14 more years of real tumultuous, like not stable grow seasons. Wherever crops are grown commercially at this moment, they're going to need to be pushed further south. So how do you come up with all these new growing areas? And and I'm more into the ancient grains, because I know we're going to have to substitute crops. And where could you substitute a crop that has this much moisture and this much heat and this many degree cooling days that'll set a plant seed to start to germinate the following year? And then you start to do the research on this, and then you can kind of get a good forecast of where things might bend, move, and morph to. And then, you said, well, you've been on the money for 5 years. Well, all I do is research about where things moved in the past, where they might move in the future again, and where we sit today. So where would it be in 5 years from now?
Yeah, well,
that's kind of all I'm doing. Food is the most important thing, and food's going to be less and less. That's all I'm going to say it there. I can break it down into one thing. Your food price is going to skyrocket, double, triple, quadruple, like it has through every grand solar minimum. And food availability for 8 billion people is going to be substantially reduced. Then what? And I'll let you come up with your own conclusions of the then what will happen. Factory farm meats aren't going to do it.
Yeah, well, most people, they've got their, like I do, a fancy smartphone and so much technology. I mean, this can't possibly affect us, is what they think. But most people are, watching TikTok and not doing the research like you have. So I'm definitely grateful for that, because not a lot of people want to look at graphs and historical grow charts and weather patterns, but it's important information. And I appreciate you mentioning my website. There's hundreds and hundreds of recipes and videos on there. I also do a weekly podcast, Harvest Eating Podcast. It's in iTunes, and that I've had since 2010. And I always talk about a recipe on there. And I've been talking more and more about food storage and growing, and I think it's what I'm solely focused on at this point, is adding food security and helping others to do the same. So, yeah, good stuff, David.
All right, thank you. And I'll leave all the links in the description box below the video so you can follow up on a lot of things we talked about. And I'll even list some of the ancient grains, because I know we ran through, and there's a probably handful of people that hadn't heard of a lot of these different types of grains before. They're not widely grown unless you go to, some African nations, or you go to South America or something. You're not going to find a lot of this stuff. So you're going to have to seek it out. And that's part of the point too. So hopefully this will give you a couple of breadcrumbs. Again, no pun intended. It's where you can start your journey to find your way down through different things in your culinary journey for food storage, and also nutrition during these. Well, it's going to be lean times for some, but if you're prepared, you're going to be well taken care of. So Keith, I appreciate you joining. I learned a lot from you today too. I got a whole list of things that I'll take notes for too, of my action list that is way back in the back of the radar that needs to be front and center.
Yeah, well, we all have that, and I appreciate the time, David.
Okay, bye for now.
Yeah.